Let's discuss the different types of unemployment that people can experience. Essentially, we've got a couple types that we've already seen in this course. We saw this when we talked about the natural level of output. And of course, we learned that the natural level of output is associated with the natural rate of unemployment. And where do we get this natural rate from, or natural level? Well, of course, this is when we smooth out our business cycle, right? So that's that, method that we see. It's done with a computer. You put in your data uh, regarding unemployment or output. You put in your data regarding these figures, and you tell the computer to smooth out all of the bumps in the business cycle. Right? So ultimately, we have what we call this natural rate of unemployment, which is associated with the natural level of output. And this is from the smoothing of our actual data. And we also have cyclical unemployment, which is based upon the business cycle. Right? So we have what we call booms and busts, or you can call them expansions and contractions. And here we have some Canadian labor data. We see that the red is the actual unemployment figures, and we see that the yellow is the natural rate of unemployment. Notice that back in the 60s, we had a low natural rate of unemployment, down at just below 4%. And then through the 70s, it increased up to close to 8% in Canada's economy. Currently, it looks, or at least where I should say, at the end of this, we see a slight decrease down to around 7%. Of course, you might recall that in the early 70s, there was an oil crisis. So OPEC cut back on their supply of oil. And this caused, of course, lower production, since oil is used in all forms of production. And it also caused, of course, increased unemployment because, well, if you're not producing, i.e., if you don't have the oil to produce things, well, then you're not going to need as many people to work. We get into the 80s. And in the 80s, of course, because of the oil crises that were experienced in the 70s, you might recall there was one at the beginning of the 70s, as I just mentioned, but there was also one at the end of the 70s. So OPEC basically did this twice during the 70s, where they cut oil production. And since oil production is low, this means that the price of oil is going up. And since oil is used in every single good that is produced, it means that the prices of all goods increased. This, of course, was the main cause of inflation during this time period. And of course, in order to get the economy back on track, back to its natural level, increasing output, the governments and central banks also engaged in monetary expansion, which had added to this inflation. So inflation in the 80s was above 10%. It was quite high. And the governments and central banks of Canada, or sorry, the government and central bank of Canada, wanted to decrease inflation, i.e., they wanted to disinflate the economy. So we see in the early to mid 80s, the unemployment rate goes very, very high. Again, this is because there was disinflation. Remember the trade off between inflation and unemployment. So, this first large increase in unemployment is due to disinflation. And the government central bank went from about 10% inflation down to 4% inflation. Now, in the 90s, the central bank engaged in some say an experiment, where they tried to get inflation to 0%. This was called the zero inflation target. So again, we're going from a 4% inflation rate down to a 0% inflation rate. So again, a disinflation process. And we see that as a result of this disinflation process, the unemployment rate again went way up, reaching nearly 12%. Then we get back into our regular business cycle. We can see that in about 2008, of course, we had the financial crisis, which increased our unemployment rate again. So we went into that, Great Recession, as it's called, in 2008. Okay? But we can see the business cycle here in the form of the unemployment rate. Okay? So that, of course, would be our cyclical unemployment. So there's some other things that cause unemployment in the economy. So the main one, or the big one that we often talk about, would be frictional unemployment. So frictional unemployment is about matching your skills. If you're looking for a job, you want to match your skills to what a employer or firm wants in the form of skills. And there's essentially two main categories within frictional unemployment, or two main areas that we can look at. The first one is the simple time lag between jobs. So that is, you've got skills, employers are looking for those skills, but it simply takes you time to actually find that combination. You need to find that firm that's looking for your skills, and they need to want you. So it also gets into aspects of, company culture. Some companies are laid back, other companies are very, very, let's get things done, right? A very intense kind of atmosphere. Right? So there's different cultures within companies that also need to be matched up. So it's not just the skills, but generally when you lose your job, you don't immediately get a new job. Right? So it takes time. So that's the form of frictional unemployment. You have the skills are being sought. It takes time for you to match together. The second aspect of frictional unemployment is a little bit more serious. This is the case where you've got the skills, but companies aren't looking for those skills. So the economy progresses through time. And perhaps your skills are not exactly what people are looking for. So again, we're looking at matching skills, but unfortunately, there is no match. Imagine you are a worker at a plant, at a factory, and this factory has been using the same technology for 20, 25 years, 30 years. They've been using this technology for quite a while. And you had a job here 20, 25, 30 years ago, and you knew this technology. You went to school, you learned this technology, and you've been using this technology now for a couple or 3 decades. And then this factory decides to upgrade their technology. And you no longer have the skills, or you don't have the skills to operate this particular type of machinery. So you're not up to speed on this particular technology. Therefore, you lose your job. And what you find is that all of the other factories in this particular industry have also upgraded their technology. So your skills actually do not match with what is being sought. In this case, you're also frictionally unemployed, but you're going to be unemployed for a longer period of time. So your skills do not necessarily match with the current economic conditions. So this is a more serious aspect of frictional unemployment. Structural unemployment is a type of unemployment that occurs when the wages that are paid are higher than equilibrium. So if you've taken microeconomics, you know that supply and demand, essentially work together to find through the invisible hand of the economy. They basically end up at this equilibrium price. When it comes to labor, the equilibrium price is called a wage. And in the case of structural unemployment, we have a situation where the equilibrium wage is not what we are using in our economy. So we've got powerful groups. This group could be the government, or this group could be a union. And these powerful groups actually establish a wage which is higher than the equilibrium. Right? Equilibrium, we could say this is what it should be based on microeconomic principles. So wage laws like minimum wage are established by the government. And because we have this minimum wage, there are many people who say generally the minimum wage is higher than what it should be. It's higher than what we would consider a microeconomic equilibrium. Unions, same thing. They essentially collectively bargain in order to, ask for benefits and wages which are higher than what would be the equilibrium wage. And because the wages are higher than what they should be, we experience what we call structural unemployment. So I'm going to demonstrate this or explain this using minimum wage. So imagine that we currently have our minimum wage, which I believe is around $12.40 per hour. So this is the current minimum wage in British Columbia. And ultimately, we have some people in your classroom working and other people in your classroom not working. Now, we'll say that ultimately the people that are working want a job, they're employed. And we'll say the people that are not working do not want a job, therefore they're not in the labor force. All right. So we'll start with that assumption. So in the classroom, we've got unemployed people, we've got employed people, and we have people who are not in the labor force. Now imagine what would happen if I actually increased the minimum wage to $50 per hour. If we increased the wage to $50 per hour, one of the things that would happen would be that some of those people who are currently not in the labor force, they might actually be or say to themselves, I would actually like a job at $50 an hour. I'm going to go get a job. I mean, ultimately, that's $100,000 a year. So some people might even drop out of school in order to go and try to find a job. So a lot of individuals go out and try to find a job. They have entered the labor force. However, many of these individuals are not going to get hired. Therefore, they will be unemployed. So notice what has happened. We've actually increased the unemployment rate. The original condition, we had employed people at $12.40 per hour, and we had people who are not in the labor force. Ultimately, under that situation, employed and not in the labor force, the unemployment rate is 0%. When I raised the wage to $50 per hour, we ended up with employed people and unemployed people. And again, some people still choosing not to work, not in the labor force. But what's important here is that we now have unemployed people, because firms are not going to hire everybody that wants to work, especially at this wage rate of $50 per hour. Working in a clothing store, nobody's going to pay you $50 an hour to basically fold clothing. So we see that the unemployment rate has increased because the wage is being pushed higher than what it should be. So minimum wage laws, as well as unions, tend to cause unemployment rates to rise. There's a third category here known as efficiency wages, which I'll leave to you to read in the textbook. Um, I would say that I kind of disagree with the concept of efficiency wages causing unemployment, but again, I'll let the textbook describe that one for you. And lastly, we have what we call seasonal unemployment. So seasonal unemployment simply has to do with the different seasons that we have within a year. And of course, different seasons bring about different job opportunities. During the summertime, there's a lot of agricultural work available. Let's say fruit picking. If you happen to be a fruit picker, then you're going to be employed in the summer. However, during the winter months, there's no fruit to pick. Therefore, you're going to be unemployed. You are seasonally unemployed in the winter. Ski instructors will face the opposite. So in the winter, of course, ski instructors are employed, but during the summer, they're going to be unemployed. Ski instructors will be seasonally unemployed during the summer. So these are our basic types of unemployment in the economy. So next up, we'll be talking about some of the measurement issues and the government interventions that we have in Canada that help people become employed if they are currently unemployed.